Well, two elections coming up this autumn, one in Britain, one in the United States, both with huge implications for our country. Indeed, you could argue the American election will have bigger implications for us than the British election if Mr. Trump wins.
And I'm sure you all know that Andrew Neil was editor of the Sunday Times for 11 years. He then went on to become a high-profile broadcaster, famous both for his forensic interviewing and wry view of the world. Some politicians were so scared of him that they didn't go on his programmes. Now he's coming home at last to present a show on Times Radio, the election station, of course. It's going to be from 1 o'clock, Monday to Thursday afternoon, starting in September. And we can speak to him now. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning to you.
I mean, I was going to say why, but why not, really?
Well, two elections coming up this autumn, one in Britain, one in the United States, both with huge implications for our country. Indeed, you could argue the American election will have bigger implications for us than the British election if Mr. Trump wins. So there's plenty to talk about and plenty to go on. The news cycle is crammed with incredible stories at the moment, important stories.
We've got Michael Gove coming on in about 15 minutes. Now, I know you've reduced many a politician to a pile of candle wax with your questions. So do you have a question from Michael Gove? Well, what should we ask him?
The aim is not to reduce them to candle wax. The aim is to find out if they really know if they know what they're talking about. Because after all, they're the ones that are governing the country. So it'd be quite useful if they knew what they were talking about. I mean, you've caught me on the hop here, but for Mr. Michael Gove, I would say, well, look, the government has claimed that the reason inflation went to over 10% was not the government's fault. It was not the government's fault. These are international matters. Don't blame the government. Fair enough. So therefore, why should the government get any credit for inflation going back to 2%?
Yeah. Okay, we'll ask that one. And the second one is it true that it's your birthday today?
It is my birthday today. I mean, it's tough being 44 these days. But,
Tell me about it.
They say the 44 is the new 30, so I'm feeling quite special.
Andrew, I'm actually 44, and we don't look that dissimilar in age, actually.
It's true. How are you going to celebrate?
You've just cheered me up immeasurably.
How are you going to celebrate, Andrew?
I've got a couple of friends coming round for dinner tonight, including Paul McKenna, the great hypnotist. So maybe he can actually hypnotize me to be 44.
The infected blood scandal is kind of really, we've been talking about it for some time now. It feels maybe, 5, 6, 7 days, but it kind of gets worse. And we had the inquiry report yesterday. We're going to have the compensation today. We've been talking about kind of institutions that you're supposed to trust telling us that everything's fine when actually it's not. And what really that does to a society, what that does to trust, this level of cover-up, does it surprise you? And do you think it still goes on today?
It still goes on, and yet it still surprises me. And what surprises me is it's been going on for so long. I mean, as editor of the Sunday Times in the late 1980s, I ran a campaign to get justice for those who had been infected by infected blood supplies, blood imported from America, which had been infected by HIV. And then people got blood transfusions with this blood and they became infected. And we ran a long campaign. And at the time, we thought we had made major progress. We thought that we not only had we got to the bottom of it, but that the government was going to react. I remember getting on a plane to Edinburgh, and Tam Dalyell, the wonderful Labour MP at the time, says to everybody at the front of the plane, it's thanks to this man pointing at me that there is justice for those who've been infected, whose blood supplies have been infected. And that was a little bit embarrassing. It also turned out to be untrue because we hadn't got the breakthrough we thought. Here we are now in 2024. Only now do we have the definitive investigation and the government at last saying it is going to compensate those. For many, far too late. As I look around, and I look at the post office scandal, and I look at the infected blood scandal, you sometimes think that there is a conspiracy against ordinary people in this country. And that what passes for left-right debate between the parties, debates on the left and the right, are largely irrelevant to what is happening to ordinary British people who are done badly and find it so difficult to get redress. Ask the postmasters, ask those whose families have been infected by this bad blood.
I'm really interested, actually, just very quickly on that. What was the reaction from government, from people within the health service to that campaign? What was it? How would you sum it up?
Well, at the time, we were sticking to them every week and almost on the front page every week too. And although there was a lot of denial and a lot of saying it's not as bad, you're exaggerating and all the rest of it, there came a recognition that there was a major problem and something had to be done. And they said something is being done. And I'm afraid our mistake was to take that at face value because, as we now know, very little was done, certainly nowhere near enough. It was shoved under the carpet. The British state went into defensive mode, happened regardless of who was in government. Labour and Conservatives oversaw this scandal, and here we are today. It's shaming, and I think the media should have been doing more too, but we weren't the ones taking the decisions.
Such an important point that the public inquiry is actually part of the cover-up. Because you wait 10 years and have a public inquiry that takes 10 years, it doesn't really matter what it concludes because it's 20 years have gone past, people are dead. The people who did it are out of jobs or they're dead. So actually that becomes part of the cover-up. The cover-up that Brian Langstaff was talking about, he says, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead, but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive and more chilling in its implications. And that is at the heart of the British establishment, undoubtedly. How do you fix the political establishment? It's something I'm going to ask Kate McCann about, who's Times Radio's political editor. You're not going to be able to answer this, Kate, but we have so many people getting in touch this morning who are sick. They're sick to the back teeth of this because it's not just one thing, it's everything. It's this issue where something happens, a long time goes by, people cover it up, people give lines to take to ministers, people defend, and then 25 years later, they apologise when that apology is hollow. How do you change that culture? Are we part of it with the media? I'm sure we are as well. How do you change a culture? Are people actually interested in changing a culture?
I think they are, and I'm going to give you a positive answer because I think that's where we need to try and move to now. I actually thought your interview with Mel Stride this morning was a good starting point for trying to change the way that this works. Because saying to a minister like Mel Stride, well, it sounds like what you're giving me is a line to take, he then reacted to that by actually answering your questions in a different way, I thought. It sounded to me like he had sat back, because when he went to answer another question, he said to you, well, as I've said, the compensation, and then he almost caught himself and started to answer in a more human way by saying it's very difficult, actually, and it is a long-running process. We are going to pay, but we recognise it's been very hard. I think that's the starting point. I think you're right, journalism has some part in this, and the way that we go about accountability has some part in this. I also think we are potentially on the cusp of, well, whatever happens, a new government. We're going to have an election, which is a moment in time where the country gets to have a say, which means that everybody needs to participate in that direction of travel. But I also think for some of these institutions, there has been a reckoning, and the NHS is currently seeing that, not just on this infected blood scandal, but on maternity too. And the fact that we are talking about where things are going wrong and why they are going wrong is a big part of trying to change that, actually, and about changing the public mood about whether these institutions are untouchable.
And I'm worried about the paradox that's developing, because I feel it as well, is that things go on so long, you want heads. And so we say, this person needs to be prosecuted, this person needs to be sacked, this person, Paula Venables, never can work again. And yet we also in the same breath say, wouldn't it be lovely if we lived in a world in which when a mistake happens, someone owns up to it immediately and says, this has happened, I don't want it to go on for the next 10 years. We've got to somehow separate those two things where you want justice, but you've got to have some sort of culture in these big institutions where once a mistake happens, people talk about it so it gets fixed.
And you absolutely can have that. It does exist. It exists in the nuclear industry in a really, really good and healthy way, because that industry recognises that if a mistake happens in the nuclear world, it can have massive implications. So they have a duty of candour and a situation where if somebody makes a mistake or something goes wrong, you hold your hands up to it, you explain what's happened, and that person is not penalised. They're not penalised for making the mistake, and they are praised for calling it out. Unfortunately, what happens in the NHS at the moment, very frequently, is that people feel that they cannot call out mistakes, so they try to bury them, so they keep happening, and then a much bigger situation unfolds. It is entirely possible to do that, but it comes from management. And one of the things for me from this report is, you're right, not necessarily about picking out names, but about the structure of society and the way things work. And the civil service, for me, is one of the most shocking elements of this.
Yeah, explain that. So this is such a good point, because it's not just the NHS, not just ministers.
No. I mean, look, ministers and the NHS bear a huge responsibility here, but the civil service is responsible in this report for destroying documents, knowingly destroying documents, when an investigation was launched into why they were destroyed, for basically doing a terrible job of it so nobody would ever be found responsible, and for giving ministers lines which they knew and understood were not complete, even when, I mean, one of the most shocking parts of this report for me was when ministers actually went back to the departments and said, we can't keep saying this stuff. It's not politically sustainable, but it's also not morally right. And there's a description of a meeting where ministers were in a room with people who were infected, and the description of it is, I've never felt a change. One of the ministers was in tears, and still after that point, nothing happened.
Yeah.
Still after that point, nothing happened. This is an institutional problem, and it's an accountability problem, and we all bear responsibility for that.
Excellent points. I mean, we're not going to fix it now, but the conversation should certainly continue. Now, Kate, great to speak to you as ever. That's Kate McCann, Times Radio's political editor.